Antonio Licciardi was born on December 30th, 1899, in a small town in Sicily called Licciardi e Eubea. When he was born, his maternal uncle, who was a town official, told his mother to not register him as being born on that day, and instead to wait until January 1st of the next year, 1900. She was not convinced that this would affect his life much, and decided against it. Little did she know that it would have a major effect on his life. Antonio married Carmela Bove in February of 1928. Carmela was only 15 when he proposed to her, and was 13 years younger than him, which made him 28. She was 7 when her father died and 12 when her mother passed away, and had been mistreated by the distant family she was staying with. They had arranged another marriage for her, but she didn't want it and was kicked out of the house. Even though her marriage to Antonio was arranged, they were still severely in love. Whenever Antonio traveled out of town, he would come back with chocolates, caramels, and candy for her. A year after their marriage, they had their first child, Teresa. Later on, they would have 3 more sons, Rosario, Giuseppe, and Sebastiano. Antonio was schooled formally through the 5th grade. In respect to others in the town, he was considered very educated. Every day he would read the newspaper, and also enjoyed to read novels. It was common for most people in town to complete 5th grade or less. Other people from Licciardi would come to him to write letters for them, because he was well versed in writing. Antonio was drafted to World War I at the young age of 16. At this time, Italy was desperately losing the war. He, like most of the other young recruits, did not go through training because of the dire need for men. Coming from Sicily, the cold weather of the mountains of northern Italy facing Austria was much of a shock to these young soldiers who were used to a warmer climate. They were deployed to the mountains in the snow with a rifle, after never handling one before, some hand grenades, and a backpack with little food. After a month of being in the mountains, he and other men got severe frostbite. Many died there in the snow, while others, like Antonio, were barely surviving. They were taken to a hospital where they were treated for their injuries. After a month, the general came in to pick and choose men to go back out to the war front. Antonio was told to go back to the front lines, while his future brother-in-law was told to stay there in the hospital. He lasted a mere 1 or 2 days until a recurrence of what happened before hit him again. This time, the doctors had to amputate his legs from below the knee down. He had prostheses for the rest of his life. Every 5 years or so, he would have to go to Rome or Palermo to have his prostheses adjusted. His original set was made in about 1917 and worked perfectly except for minor needs of refurbishing every now and then. The prosthetic leg and ankle were made of wood, and the part from below the knee would go into a hollow piece that connected to the leathery upper part of the leg. These were held together with 2 metal pieces running up the inner part of the leg. 3 belts would close the upper part, and his knees had metal pieces and hinges. These prosthetics allowed him to walk almost naturally, and he didn't need a cane until he was about 50 years old, when he had a stroke. Unless you knew, you couldn't really notice that he was missing his legs. In town, there were other people who were in similar positions, and they formed a club for war-wounded veterans. They met every afternoon to talk and play cards, and mostly just socialize with each other. The wounded war veterans were entitled to a front seat on the bus or train, and were identified by a dark metal button on their lapel. Not only did the war leave a lasting physical ailment on Antonio, he was also left with mental trauma. Being 16 years old and going to war in the snowy mountains, after never handling or even seeing a rifle or anything of the like in town, and being told that you have to go and kill men, but not to be killed yourself, is utterly demanding. When the teenage boys saw German and Austrian soldiers yelling and shooting, they would get scared, drop their guns, and run the other way. Whenever there was thunder and lightning, the largest man became the smallest ant. Antonio would curl his whole body forward, twist sideways, and would go sit with the blanket in a corner of the room, cover himself with the blanket, and shake. If in the midst of eating, thunder and lightning would start, he would order everyone to get away from the table, stop eating, and he would sit on the chair and not move. All of this would have been different if he had been registered as being born on January 1st of 1900. For the first year and a half of World War I, Italy was losing desperately and needed more able men of age to fight for them. Any boy 16 years or older would go into war, which was anyone born up to December 31st, 1899, a day after Antonio was born. If he was registered as being born 2 days later, his whole life would have been different. However, the war made him become an old man at a young age. He was addicted to smoking like much of the other veterans, and would smoke as many as 3 to 4 packs of cigarettes a day. During World War II, it was extremely difficult to find cigarettes. A courier was paid to go from their small town all the way to the city, either Catania or Naples, which were 800 miles away, to buy cigarettes on the black market. From smoking, he developed emphysema and high blood pressure in his 50s. At 54, he had a stroke, and did not speak for an entire year after that. In that year, he managed to quit smoking, though. Little by little, he started to recover to a good state. The last 10 years of his life, he struggled with health problems, but he mostly lived okay. In 1941, when World War II started, Antonio was sent an enlistment letter saying he had been sent to the war again. At 41 years old, he was still eligible for war in the government's eyes. He went to town hall to dispute the letter, and then was sent to the military district because he was missing his legs. He had a paper identification booklet that said what kind of injury he had, but was told that it doesn't matter and he had to go to war. Eventually, they recognized that he was not able and allowed him to stay at home. After World War I, Antonio worked on his father's farm. All kinds of food was produced on the farm, and the family would give food to people passing by. Eventually, Antonio became in charge of matters of work for the farm. The men he hired to help with work were not men that had jobs for most of the year. He looked for 2 or 3 guys that people did not hire easily to help them get some money. Antonio would send his kids to buy cold cuts, breads, eggplant, and sausages to have food prepared to feed the men working for the farm. He was not required to do this since they were being paid a salary for their day's work, but he wanted to do better for them. His wife did not encourage this, since they didn't have a lot of money to begin with. But Antonio would tell her that they had less than we do, so we should do it. The whole family would go to the farm to spend the summer and have parties every night. People vacationing in the area were invited to the farm, and they would dance, play cards, sing, listen to music, and just have a good time. At lunchtime, he would climb the large fig tree to pick some figs, even with his prosthetic legs. He put his hands on the lowest branch and would backflip up to the higher branches to reach the tallest figs. Antonio was a very tall, strong man. He had very deep blue eyes and was very fair with red cheeks. Even though he was Sicilian, he looked more like a German or Swede. He was very funny and liked to clown around. Even though he had prostheses, he would have races with his kids, and would sometimes even win. He would jump up on the horses by holding them with one hand and pushing up onto the saddle with the other. He could be found doing handstands and walking around like that on the farm. In town, there wasn't much to do, but Antonio would always start different games for the other people there. One time, he had a race organized between a barber and someone who could only walk on one leg. The barber said he was a good runner, but the other man ended up winning, and there were at least 50 men gathered around in the town square watching. He also served on a committee in town that dealt with the poor, and was even nicknamed Lawyer Mouth for the way he was able to talk to politicians about getting things done for the town. Antonio died on June 22, 1966, at his home in Licciardi. He was laid to rest on his bed in the house, and looked very peaceful, exactly how he looked while asleep under the fig tree on the farm.